probably heard of the term locked room mystery before. It is a crime that is committed under circumstances in which it seems impossible for the perpetrator to have entered the scene, committed the crime, and then left without being detected, to the point where it almost seems as though the culprit must have the ability to walk through walls. A classic theoretical example would be a murder committed in a windowless room, with the door found locked from the inside. Of course, locked room mysteries are more often associated with works of detective fiction than with real-life cases. But there are in fact a handful of true blue real-life locked room mysteries that have left investigators bewildered, and that read like something off of the pages of an Agatha Christie novel. The story of Laetitia Toureaux is one such case, and one that, due to the baffling nature of the crime and the sheer amount of time elapsed since it took place, is incredibly unlikely to ever truly be solved. First, before we get into Laetitia Toureaux and the circumstances surrounding her death, let's first take a look at the time and place of her murder. The year was 1937, and the city was Paris, France. To say that this was a tense political era in Europe is very much an under-exaggeration. Adolf Hitler had just come to power 4 years beforehand. Benito Mussolini had been leading the fascist party in Italy for 15 years, and that was where Laetitia was originally from, and the world was stepping onto the doormat of World War II. Most of Europe was a powder keg about to explode, and that tension more than likely played directly into Laetitia Toureaux's murder. The basics of her life are as follows. She was a young woman, only 29 years old at the time of her death. She was Italian, born Laetitia Marie Josephine Nourrisset on September 11, 1907 in the Valle d'Aosta region of Italy. In the 1920s, as Mussolini came to power, Laetitia and her mother, 3 brothers, and sister decided to emigrate to France, while her father stayed behind in Italy. In 1930, she married a Frenchman named Jules Toureaux that she had met while working at a pottery factory, gaining French nationality as a result of their marriage. Laetitia and Jules were reportedly completely devoted to each other, but sadly, Jules died of tuberculosis in 1935. His death left Laetitia not only a widow, but financially destitute. Although Jules had been from a rather well-off family, his family hadn't approved of him marrying someone they perceived to be of lower class, and refused to provide Laetitia with anything from Jules' will following his death. Now needing to support herself, Laetitia got herself a job in an industrial factory that manufactured shoe polish in Saint-Ouen, a township located north of Paris, just outside of the Périphérique, or the ring road that encircles the main city of Paris. At her job, Laetitia was considered a diligent worker and a model employee, working long shifts 6 days a week. She also had a second job at the cloakroom of a high-class Parisian nightclub. Patrons of this club could also pay to dance with employees. At the time, this type of employment might have been considered a bit seedy, but by all accounts, Laetitia enjoyed her job at the nightclub. At the time of Laetitia Toureaux's death in 1937, the Parisian metro was already almost 40 years old, with the first line having opened up in 1900 at the World's Fair, and expanding quickly up until World War I kicked off in 1914. However, 29-year-old Laetitia Toureaux had the unfortunate honor of being the first person to ever be murdered on the Parisian metro. Here's how it happened, or at least, what we know for sure about how it happened. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on May 16, 1937, Laetitia Toureaux boarded Line 8 on the metro at the station Porte de Charenton, located on the eastern border of the city. At the time, this station was the terminal of Line 8. Prior to the 1990s, the Parisian metro was divided into first and second class cars, the only metro system in the world to have ever offered a first class option. Laetitia got on the only first-class car of the 5-car metro. May 16th was a Sunday, on top of being Pentecost, a public holiday in France, and the city was facing an early heat wave. As a result, the Porte de Charenton station was bustling, full of passengers who wished to make the most of the warm weather on their day off. However, the first-class train cars, being obviously more expensive than the second-class cars, were never nearly as crowded and in fact tended to be rather empty most of the time. Based on the witness evidence of the metro driver, the ticket punchers, as well as other passengers, Laetitia Toureaux was actually the only person on board the first-class metro car when it pulled away from the Porte de Charenton station on May 16th. However, a mere 60 seconds or so later, when the metro pulled into the Porte Dorée station, the handful of first-class passengers who boarded the train were greeted with a horrific sight. A young woman, slumped in her seat, with the handle of a switchblade sticking out of her neck, bleeding profusely and clearly on the verge of death, if not already dead. No assailant was in sight. Somehow, in between Laetitia boarding the metro car alone at Porte de Charenton and the metro arriving at Porte Dorée, the very next station, someone had snuck into the metro car, killed her, and then snuck right back out. Understandably, the other first-class passengers, consisting of a local dentist named Major Dobré and his family, as well as another small group of women, were panicked. Since Major Dobré had medical experience, he attempted to attend to Laetitia. However, although she was still clinging onto life and reportedly even attempting to speak, she was well beyond help at this point, and she passed away en route to the hospital. Laetitia's murder, beyond making the grim history as the first person to be murdered on the Parisian metro, sent shockwaves throughout the city for multiple reasons. Not only was there no evidence of who the murderer might have been or their motive, it was also completely unknown how the killer had managed to pull off the murder before seemingly disappearing into thin air. Police suspected right off the bat that Laetitia Toureaux's murder must have been a professional hit, due simply to the complicated logistics of pulling it off. But besides that, in a time before DNA analysis, before security cameras, before fingerprint databases, police were left with very little to work with. So they worked with what they did have, which was Laetitia Toureaux herself. Perhaps by looking into her background, they could discover if she had anyone in her life who may have wanted her dead, because this was a murder that certainly would have required some planning, and thus was heavily unlikely to be a simple random killing. Little did the police know, their investigations were about to uncover a whole new side of Laetitia Toureaux, arguably even multiple new sides. Reconstructing a timeline of Laetitia Toureaux's movements that day did not reveal anything odd or suspicious. On the day she was killed, she had eaten lunch with her mother and siblings, then spent the afternoon dancing at a dance hall with her younger brother and some friends, before leaving at around 6 p.m. and making her way to the metro station where she would soon be mysteriously murdered. Unable to glean anything useful from Laetitia's movements that day, police then questioned the various witnesses who had seen Laetitia board the metro that evening, all of whom agreed that Laetitia had been alone, that she was the only one to board the first-class metro car at the Porte de Charenton station, and that no one else had been in that car when she had entered it or when the passengers at the following station had found her stabbed. Passengers from the second-class carriages also agreed that no one had entered or exited the second-class carriages while they were traveling between stations, i.e. that someone who boarded the metro on a second-class carriage had not moved between metro cars while they were in motion in order to board the first-class carriage, kill Laetitia, and then return back to the second-class carriage before the metro reached the next stop. Although this is perhaps the scenario that most may initially jump to as a solution to this bizarre locked box mystery, police confirmed that the interior doors that divided the carriages were locked and had not been tampered with, making the idea of someone traveling in between the carriages undetected within 60 seconds a practical impossibility. Examining the murder weapons similarly led to nothing but dead ends. There were no fingerprints on the knife, and it was a common model that did not offer any clues as to who its owner may have been. The fact that there were no fingerprints on the knife added to the theory that this was a professional killing, as it indicates that the murderer was wearing gloves, and as previously stated, this was a rather hot day in May, so there was no need to wear gloves for warmth. But none of this told police anything that they had not already suspected. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. Although investigators kept running into dead ends, it wasn't too long after the investigation started that a man would come forward with information about Laetitia herself that would paint a whole new picture of this seemingly normal young woman. This man's name was George Rouffignac, and he claimed that Laetitia Toureaux had been employed in his private detective agency for a little over a year, from around October 1935 to November 1936. Laetitia's job at the nightclub was in fact an extension of her job at this detective agency. George had gotten her the job, as nightclub cloakrooms were often used as drop-off points for letters and documents containing sensitive information. Laetitia could thus use her job in the nightclub cloakroom as a way of intercepting these sensitive documents. Another interesting piece of information regarding Laetitia's private life also soon came to the surface. She had apparently been engaging in corporate espionage. France is rather well known for their workers' strikes, and in 1936 there had been some pretty major strikes that heavily impacted the factory's production line. In an attempt to sniff out future strikes before they happened, these companies would sometimes hire fake employees from detective agencies in order to keep an eye on employees' actions. And Laetitia had been one of these faux employees hired at the Sant-One factory that she worked at. While this information about the true nature of Laetitia's employment doesn't offer up any specific insights into who killed her or how they did it, it does provide some potential motives. Perhaps in her investigative work she had managed to get on somebody's bad side, and that person had then come after her. However, investigators had only just started diving down the rabbit hole that was Laetitia Toureaux's private life. There was still much more left to uncover. Upon further investigation, police discovered that Laetitia had been a member of the French anti-fascist group known as, please bear with me, La Ligue Républicaine du Bien Public, or roughly translated, the Republican League for Public Good. Fascism was on the rise throughout Europe in the 1930s, and groups like La Ligue were formed to stand in opposition to fascist sentiments. However, it seems that Laetitia's membership in this group had less to do with her own personal political beliefs, and more to do with what was apparently Laetitia's favorite pastime, espionage. See, in order to join the group, you needed a sponsor, and Laetitia had two. The first was her employer at the private detective agency, George Rouffignac, and the second was a man called Inspector Seytou, a police officer. In this time of political unrest, the police would often employ citizens to keep an eye on active political groups like La Ligue. And Inspector Seytou told investigators that Laetitia had in fact been a police informant since her teens. And because Laetitia's web of spying and informing wasn't already complicated enough, police soon discovered that Laetitia had also made a few visits to the Italian embassy in the weeks before her death. Were these the normal visits of an immigrant to their home country's embassy? Or could Laetitia have potentially been an informant for the Italian government on top of being one for French police, her employer, and whoever her clients were at the detective agency? The answer to that question was never uncovered. However, in investigating Laetitia's ties to her home country, police uncovered one final piece to the complex puzzle that was Laetitia's life, one that might actually provide plausible clues as to who may have killed her and why. As it turned out, not only was Laetitia involved with possibly reporting on the activities of a French anti-fascist group, she was also involved with possibly reporting on the activities of a French fascist group known as La Cagoule, also known as the Hood. The political unrest throughout Europe in the 1930s were forming the foundations of what would soon become World War II, and already Europe was quietly consolidating into two sides. Those who would side with the fascist Germany in the event war broke out, and those who would side against Germany, with the likes of the UK and the Soviet Union. As of the mid-1930s, France was clearly in the latter group, and the goal of La Cagoule, a group that had ties with Mussolini's regime, was to overthrow France's current government and replace it with a government that would side with Germany and Italy. In order to achieve this goal, the group carried out bombings, thefts, assassinations. They very much were not afraid to get their hands dirty. Laetitia's precise level of involvement with La Cagoule is uncertain. All we know is that police had her listed as a known associate of the group. Was she reporting on the group's activities, as she was doing with her job at the factory and La Ligue? Or was her membership in this association indicative of her true political beliefs? It's difficult to say. However, given La Cagoule's tendency to carry out executions that bore resemblances to Laetitia's murder, police leaned toward the idea that a member of La Cagoule had killed Laetitia Toureaux after discovering that she had been double-crossing them. After all, Laetitia had been an informant for the French police, and it's not an enormous leap to assume that she eventually ended up informing on La Cagoule. Although this idea makes sense on paper, there was no actual concrete evidence to prove this theory correct, and it doesn't answer the most puzzling part of the case, which is how the assassination was carried out in the first place. Later that year, in November 1937, police would get a vital piece of evidence that indicated their suspicions regarding La Cagoule being involved in Laetitia's murder were true. Following a raid carried out against the fascist group, in which several high-ranking members of La Cagoule were arrested, a couple of different group members named Pierre Lecouty and Fernand Jacobiez told police that La Cagoule had assassinated Laetitia. They claimed that Laetitia had, as police had suspected, been discovered to have been spying on the group on behalf of the French government, and that the group planned out her murder as punishment for her betrayal. According to the men, another member of the group, a man named André Tenaille, had followed Laetitia in the weeks leading up to her death, learning her routines, and figured out the ideal moment in her typical day to carry out the murder. He then passed this information along to yet another group member, Jean Filial, who was the man that reportedly killed Laetitia Toureaux. Or was he? It's certain that Jean Filial was capable of committing horrific acts, up to and including murder. He had in fact been convicted of other murders committed on behalf of La Cagoule prior to fleeing France in the summer of 1937, only a few short months after Laetitia's murder, only to return to France during Nazi occupation in 1941. During this time, he joined a group that was tasked with finding and outing resistance members and passing information along to the Nazis, a role he seemed to have taken to with glee. Jean Filial being the man that killed Laetitia Toureaux certainly seems possible. However, Fernand Jacobiez later withdrew his confession, claiming it had been made under duress and was not accurate. Pierre Lecouty and he also offered no explanation as to how Jean Filial or any other member of the group might have actually gone about committing this mysterious murder. Experts also note that the weapon used in the murder wasn't one typically used by members of La Cagoule, and that it seems unlikely, though not impossible, that an assassin involved with the group would have left their weapon behind at the scene of the crime. Still, a member of La Cagoule assassinating Laetitia Toureaux seems to be the most likely explanation for who murdered her, and is the explanation that most investigators agree on to this day. Following this recanted confession, the trail ran cold on Laetitia Toureaux's murder for many years, in no small part due to World War II erupting in Europe only 2 years later. Unfortunately, but very much understandably, the attention of French authorities was drawn to the war effort, and solving cases like Laetitia's fell almost completely to the wayside. Once the dust from the war cleared almost a decade later, Laetitia's case was no longer being investigated and was considered closed. In 1948, a few years after the end of World War II and 11 years after Laetitia's death, police received a letter from a man who was hospitalized in a psychiatric facility, claiming that he had been the one who killed Laetitia. This letter was quickly determined to be false, and offered no true clues as to the identity of Laetitia's killer. This would be the last piece of information regarding Laetitia's murder that would come to light until 1962, when police received another, much more intriguing letter. This letter was from an anonymous man who claimed to be a doctor. This man wrote that he had been born in the southern French city of Perpignan before moving to Paris in 1935. He claims to have met Laetitia at Le Myrtage, the nightclub that she worked at, and he said that he had become romantically interested in her. Laetitia, however, had rejected his advances multiple times over, at one point apparently telling him that she was going on a date with another man. Hurt and angry at her rejection, he wrote that he had gone to confront Laetitia and ended up following her to the metro, where he had slipped into the metro car, stabbed her, and slipped back out and into a second-class car before the metro had started moving again. Although this letter seemed somewhat feasible to police, given that it was anonymous and thus offered dubious chances at tracking down the sender, and the fact that nearly 3 decades had passed since the murder at this point, there was little motivation on the part of police to reopen the case, so this lead was never pursued. When placed up against the other facts of the case and the other potential motivations, those linked to all of Laetitia's various clandestine activities, there seems to be just as much to suggest that the letter was fake as there is that it contained some kernels of truth. For one, the method of Laetitia's murder seems to align much more with an assassination carried out by a group like La Cagoule than it does a crime of passion, which would typically be carried out using a more brutal and personal method of murder, perhaps strangulation, multiple stab wounds, beatings, etc., than the rather cold, calculated, and mechanical method of a knife to the neck. Also, while this letter is the only confession that contained a somewhat plausible method in which the murder was carried out, the fact remains that out of all the witnesses that day in the metro, not one claimed to have seen another passenger enter or exit the first-class metro car besides Laetitia. While it is technically possible that someone may have slipped by without being noticed, these two claims are difficult to reconcile. And thus, with all of the known facts of the case laid out on the table, we return to the burning question that lies at the center of Laetitia Toureaux's murder. How was it carried out? Whether it was indeed Jean Filial or another member of one of the political groups Laetitia was tangled up in, or a scorned man like the 1962 letter writer, there still seems to be no good explanation as to how the murderer managed to sneak into the first-class car and kill Laetitia within the 60 seconds between the Porte de Charenton and Porte Dorée stations without being seen by a single eyewitness. Perhaps the most plausible explanation is that the killer was already lying in wait on the first-class car when it arrived at the Porte de Charenton station, killed Laetitia, and managed to slip off of the car unnoticed just before the doors closed. Remember that the interior doors that connected the metro cars were locked, so the killer could not have escaped into the second-class cars. Still, this would require that the killer knew that Laetitia would be getting onto the metro at that exact station, exact time, and exact car, and Laetitia certainly did not always take the first-class car. This would almost certainly mean that Laetitia had planned to meet her eventual killer at this precise time and place, which, given Laetitia's habit of espionage, isn't entirely out of the question. Still, this explanation requires us to contend with a lot of what-ifs and maybes that simply cannot be confirmed nearly a century later. Any route that you seem to go down almost inevitably opens up more questions than it does answers. It is unfortunate that this case, so shrouded in mystery, is one that would have been relatively easy to solve in the modern day with the advent of security cameras. As it stands, though, we rely almost entirely on speculation and the testimony of witnesses, all of whom claim that no one else entered or exited the train car that night. If they all happen to miss something, such as a person getting on or off the first-class metro car, then everything about this case is put back to square one. It's impossible to say what Laetitia Toureaux's own personal motivations truly were, whether she was a double or even a triple agent, if she was simply bringing information to anyone who would pay her for it, if she started out loyal to one group and then had a change of heart. We'll almost certainly never know. From the outside, her actions seem to resemble something of a Mobius strip, an endless loop circling back in on itself. But what seems somewhat safe to say is that Laetitia got herself caught up in a very dangerous game, being played by very dangerous people, and in the end, she lost the game and paid the ultimate price. Unfortunately, given the sheer amount of time that has passed, it is almost certain that, much like Laetitia's private life, the answers will remain hidden in the shadows, forever unresolved.